Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
And then the other big change happened when he got arthritis in his wrist around mid-1940s. So later in his career then, when he's writing Narnia, his handwriting becomes much messier, except when he writes letters to children who have written him about Narnia. So one of the problems that I've had to deal with is I'll take a look at the letter and I'll go, oh, he wrote this in the 40s. And then I'll say, oh, wait, it's about Narnia. He couldn't have. And I realize, oh, that's because what he did was he slowed down to very neatly write a letter to this child.
Wow.
So that the child could read his handwriting.
Oh, that's so cool. Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing. David Downing and I are joined by a C.S. Lewis scholar who is famous for a unique approach to Lewis. His name is Charlie Starr, and he has been analyzing C.S. Lewis's handwriting. So first, welcome.
Hey, thank you.
And tell us what got you interested in Lewis's handwriting.
Yeah, so it was an accident, and the Wade Center is to blame. So that's good. I was working on a book on C.S. Lewis's Mysterious Light manuscript back in 2011.
Explain that, what you mean.
Yeah, okay, so the Light manuscript is a manuscript that showed up out of nowhere in 1984, so that's 20 years after Lewis's death, right? And it's a 4-page story, 4 pages of foolscap, so that sort of legal-sized paper that they like to use in Lewis's day. And, the first mystery was, where did this story come from? The second mystery was, what does it mean? Because it's a very strange story with a very bizarre ending. So Taylor University owns the Light manuscript now, and I got permission to publish it in a book about the manuscript. So I was faced with a number of mysteries that needed to be solved, chief of which was it authentic? But then secondarily, when was it written? And the Light manuscript doesn't have a date on it. So as I was doing research at the Wade Center on my second ever visit.
When would that have been?
2011.
Okay.
Second ever visit, and I'm looking at all kinds of different fun manuscripts. I come across one, I'm thinking it was the Moral Good manuscript. I'm not 100% sure about that anymore, but I came across one in which the Wade Center had actually asked Walter Hooper if it was authentically Lewis because the handwriting's so different. And Walter had had written back, and that note then appears on top of the manuscript in the folder. And Walter said, yes, this is Lewis's handwriting. Lewis's handwriting changed, sometimes markedly. And so I thought, well, now, wait a minute. If Lewis's handwriting changed once, maybe it changed more than once. And since I needed to date a manuscript that had no date on it, I thought, well, now, if you can figure out what Lewis was doing with his handwriting in certain years, you might be able to date undated Lewis manuscripts. So that's how it started. And then it ballooned in 2014 when I got to come back to the Wade with the Clyde Kilby grant to actually focus entirely on Lewis's handwriting. And out of some 200 manuscripts at the Wade Center, that did not have any dates, I was able to date almost all of them.
Wow. And had you had an interest in handwriting before this, or was it this particular project that concentrated your attention?
Yeah, not a lick. And I also have no formal training or anything. So as I was trying to describe changes in Lewis's handwriting, I came up with terms that some scholar expert in handwriting would probably laugh at. So I will refer to the hockey stick F, right? Or the open figure 8 G. All right. So I just made up terms as I went along. So I am by no means a handwriting expert. I'm just an expert in C.S. Lewis's handwriting. So yeah, boy, that was a total accident, but it's been the funnest thing I've gotten to do since.
So what is your theory as to why his handwriting changed? What caused the change?
That's a great question. I think there are multiple causes. So, for example, Lewis the teenager wrote very pretty, very flowery cursive.
Probably the way he was trained in school.
Probably. And so, for example, especially his capital letters would have little extra curls in them. His teenage signature is very different from the signature that most of us are used to. And some people, for that reason, don't even think it's authentic, but it is. It's much more fancy. So Lewis goes to World War I. He gets injured. And then 1918, right? He comes back. And the handwriting hasn't changed a lot, but all the prettiness is gone, especially in the capital letters. So you got to think that was from the injury. That was from the war experience.
Well, he had 2 pieces of shrapnel in his arm, right? And one in his chest.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Was he right-handed or left-handed?
He was right-handed.
He was right-handed. Now, that's a good question. Which side did he get wounded?
I thought it was on the left side, but
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll just edit that out.
No, that's fine. I mean, I would have assumed going to war and growing up and becoming a man would probably change you a little bit.
Yeah.
My signature changed between the time I was in high school and college, so it makes sense.
Well, I think that's true of all of us.
Yeah, you grow up.
Right.
Mine has just gotten worse.
Mine's just as ugly as it has ever been, yeah.
Well, as you get more busy, you just don't take time for the flourishes.
Yeah.
You're just trying to get a job done. I remember in high school, I went through a phase where I would dot my I's with little circles. And it's just so absurd. It takes so much time.
Yeah.
So that would make sense that
Yeah.
he would change from his grammar school days until after the war. And then do you see dramatic change since then? And what is...
In 1922, he changed everything.
Why?
My only theory is something I heard from Walter Hooper, and that is Lewis enjoyed the physical act of writing.
Right.
So the idea that he might want to change his handwriting style just for fun, I think is a real possibility.
Oh, wow.
All his letters changed. So, for example, his capital I used to be like a double loop at the top, line down, loop at the bottom. But in 1922, it's just a straight line, and that's the way it is for the rest of his life. But what's really unusual is that in 22, he starts leaning everything to the left.
Yeah.
Now, normal right-handed people are going to lean to the right.
Yeah.
Well, from 22 to 24, it leans to the left, and 25, it's sort of straight up and down, and by 26, it's leaning to the right again.
Now, what is your theory about that?
I think that probably is just evolutionary, unconsciously evolutionary, where he changes to a more natural right angle because he's right-handed. Then there are a bunch
he's on a ship, and so it's slanted one way, and then the ship goes the other direction and slants the other way.
Does he change the type of instrument that he writes with? Because I've done some research looking at his annotations in his books, and I've looked at some of his manuscripts, and there's phases where he's using a blue pen, and then like a black pen, and then pencil.
It's not a pen in the sense that he's going from blue to black. It's a pen in the sense that he's going from a black inkwell to a blue inkwell.
Oh,
gotcha.
right.
He wrote with a dip pen. He did not even he hated ballpoint, and forget about typewriters.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't even like fountain pens.
Oh, okay.
He liked a dip pen because he could pause.
Yes.
He would write and he would whisper as he wrote because it's for the ear as well as the eye, Walter Hooper said. And he would then pause and dip and write again. And I read somewhere, I don't know who said this, but it was brilliant. C.S. Lewis was the master of the 6-word phrase because that's how many words you can write before you have to dip your pen again. So isn't that a neat idea?
Yeah.
I was talking to our archivist, Laura Schmidt, about unusual requests she got from the Wade Center. And someone wrote in and said, I have a theory about when Lewis used blue ink and when he used black ink.
Really?
Could you send me a list of all of his letters and what color they're in?
Oh my
man.
gosh.
She said, well, that would be a rather large project.
Yeah.
Come to the Wade and look yourself.
I had to actually look into that.
Oh, wow.
Because of trying to date the Light manuscript. So I had to study all about ink of all things, but there was actually a revolution that took place around 1930, 1929 in pen ink. In an American-based company who produced an ink called Quink. Quink ink was an alcohol-based ink that would dry quickly. And you can think of how revolutionary that would actually be. So Lewis definitely switched to Quink, and he had 2 favorite colors. One was blue-black, the other one was royal blue. And one of the arguments Catherine Linskog had made is that an earlier version of the Light story, The Man Born Blind, was written in Quink royal blue, but one fella had said, well, that ink didn't come along till the 1950s. So Lewis couldn't have written it when Barfield said he wrote it, which was, late 20s. And so I did some research online, and I found an advertisement for Quink Royal Blue in 1933 or 4. So whoever said, no, it was invented in the 50s was wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I had a professor at UCLA who was interested in handwriting. He was doing manuscripts of Benjamin Franklin, but he said, if you're trying to forge a document, not only do you need the original parchment, which is the correct year, and the original ink, now some of if it has radioactive tracers or this kind of tracer in
after
ink.
World War II, yeah.
But he also said they can look with an electron microscope and see how long the ink molecules have been disseminating in the paper fibers.
Wow.
Ooh, wow.
So even if you have the right
Wow.
ink and the right paper, they can look at it and say, this was applied recently, this wasn't applied in
Wow.
Yeah.
1782.
They're trying to make it look old, but it's
Yeah.
a forgery.
So one of the lessons here at the Wade Center would be, kids out there, don't forge.
Yeah.
You're not
Yeah.
going to get away with it.
Yeah.
You're going to get caught.
It is fascinating when you look at his notes and marks in his Bible, which you know he's going back and reading. Didn't read the whole Bible just all through every time he sat down, and so you can see there's different colors of different inks and different sections, and you can tell he's reading a section at a time and marking, and then he stops, and then it's a different color, and so obviously it's on a different day. It's kind of neat to look at that, but you think, how could you piece all that together?
Yeah.
Mm.
And sometimes he annotates in pencil.
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's any, and he uses red ink a lot. I found out in the last 2 days in some of his book annotations.
Oh, wow.
Around 1927, 28. I did want to tell you about one other time that his handwriting changed. Well, two. One is after he became a Christian, so that's September 31, right? By November 31, he's changed the way he writes the letter G. And I think it's because he didn't like the way the G looked when he wrote the word God. So he changed it to a different one, which he kept the rest of his life. And then the other big change happened when he got arthritis in his wrist around mid-1940s. So later in his career, then when he's writing Narnia and so forth, his handwriting becomes much messier.
Oh my gosh.
Much
yes.
more difficult because of that. Except when he writes letters to children who have written him about Narnia. So one of the problems that I've had to deal with is I'll take a look at a piece of a letter and I'll go, oh, he wrote this in the 40s. And then I'll say, oh, wait, it's about Narnia. He couldn't have. And I realize, oh, that's because what he did was he slowed down to very neatly write a letter to
for a
this
child.
Wow.
so that the child could read his handwriting.
Oh, that's
Wow.
so cool.
Yeah, if you look at the Letters to Malcolm manuscript, there's sections that are really hard to read because his writing gets really rough towards the end of his life.
And you know what's funny about that is near the end of his life, Lewis stopped sending typescripts of his books to the publisher because he found that when the publisher had to work from his handwritten manuscripts, they actually did a better job of transcribing them than if he sent them a typescript.
You got to pull out a magnifying glass
Yeah,
to figure
slow
out what
down.
is that an
more
E or
accurate.
is it an F?
So that's a lot of fun.
Didn't he have a real spiky stage? I remember seeing a sample. Maybe you were
Yes.
talking about this at a conference.
Yes, I call that the staccato stage.
The staccato stage. There you go.
And it came along in the 50s.
Yeah.
In 47, he called his handwriting villainous.
Villainous handwriting.
Villainous handwriting, yes.
Right.
So, in your analysis of handwriting, have you ever exposed something that people assumed was written by Lewis, but you're pretty sure he didn't write it because at that
Ooh.
stage, his handwriting looked very different?
I've had a couple of times when I've looked at book signatures
Oh.
and said, no, that's probably a forgery. So I've had that. But now let me tell you a reverse example. At the Wade Center, there is a lovely little book called Potato Pie.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Now, the Wade Center used to have recorded that Potato Pie was written predominantly by Lewis's brother Warney, with a few of the entries, and it's a series of numbered entries about their father. Potato Pie, they thought, was written primarily by Warney, with only a few entries by Lewis. Well, I looked at the handwriting and I said, no, it's the other way around. This was written mostly by Lewis, with only a few entries by Warney.
Was their handwriting that different? I don't know if I've ever seen Warney's handwriting.
See, now this is what's interesting.
Well, actually, in the Lewis family papers, doesn't he write? There's handwriting from him in the Lewis family papers, right?
There might be. Marge Mead can tell Warney's handwriting, and we actually checked
Right.
with her on that.
Gotcha.
Potato Pie.
Marge Mead is our associate director at the Wade, by the way.
And they called him Potato because their father had this Irish way of saying potato, and he would say potato.
Potato.
They called him Potato Bird.
Yeah, Potato Bird.
And sometimes they called him the OAB, which was the old air balloon. He was rather bombastic. So most of these are like humorous things that their father said. It was
and Lewis's handwriting in the early 20s, 22 to 26 or so, looks a lot like his brother's handwriting.
Oh, really?
Throughout Warney's lifetime. So
Gotcha.
Warney's handwriting didn't change as much, though I haven't studied it in detail. But yeah, they do have that in common.
Gotcha.
sometime when Warren was his secretary and did typing for him, he'll get into topics like the Korean War and politics. And Lewis was not very interested in those topics. And I always wonder if Warney was acting as with Jack's secretary and said, "Oh, I have an opinion on
things?
that." Yeah, I wonder if
executive secretary.
Yeah.
Well, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that I've seen at least one, maybe two letters that were signed C.S. Lewis, but were not signed by C.S. Lewis. I'm convinced were signed by Warney.
I hope you didn't tell that to an owner that thought they had it.
Well, in fact, recently I saw one at auction, and I'm certain it was a Lewis letter, but I don't think Lewis signed it. I didn't say anything.
Wow.
So, I think Stan Shelley, the bookseller, told us that he sometimes consults with you about signatures.
Yeah, that's right.
So did Warney took over towards the end of his life and wrote some of his
more like
correspondence?
the middle of his life.
Oh, middle. Okay.
Warney wasn't all that consistent. He wasn't there all the time because he was off in Ireland on benders. So, and so that's why Walter, for those 6 weeks, was Lewis's secretary.
Right.
Yeah.
And for some of our listeners, you may not be familiar with this name, Walter Hooper, that we've mentioned several times. Walter Hooper was an American who happened to go over to England soon before Lewis died and ended up becoming the
literary
executor of Lewis's estate. So he is an important name.
He just passed away last year, Walter did.
Right.
Yeah. Stan Shelley's a great guy.
Oh, he
Lots of
is.
fun to work
He
with.
is.
Yeah, we had fun doing a podcast with him and talking about stories, adventures, and selling rare books.
So you are now at the Wade.
Yeah.
We are allowing visitors, researchers to come by appointment as we're slowly surmounting COVID restrictions. So tell us, what is your current project?
Well, I spent my first day looking at a manuscript, which is part of the Hooper estate, I think, but the Wade has a copy of, and it is an unfinished book on prayer that Lewis attempted, according to Hooper, in the early 50s, and that's probably right. There's 40-something pages of the text, and it's really interesting, so I wanted to play with that a little bit, do some transcribing. Then yesterday and then all day today, I shifted to something I've promised the Wade I would do way back in 2014. Yeah, back in my day when we were
During the Great War.
I was at the Wade Center. And that is look through Lewis's personal library, look at his annotations, and by looking at the handwriting, we can figure out when Lewis was reading those books.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And we might learn some really new things. We might learn some surprising things. I finished another project today by accident.
Oh,
by
tell
looking
us.
through something. So the listeners might know about Don King's collection of C.S. Lewis's poetry. About 97% of all of Lewis's poems are in that book, and the only ones that aren't are ones that have been discovered since the book was published. Well, Don tried to publish the poems in chronological order, giving dates to the poems, but at the back of the book, then he had almost 40, I'm going to say, poems that didn't have dates to them. So when the book came out, I emailed Don and I said, look, if you can get me images, I can date those poems. And he was able to find a lot of images, get some permission so that I could see images of a lot of the poems. And together, I worked with Don. We were able to date absolutely every one of those poems except for one.
Wow. And what was the problem with that one?
Yeah, well, because if I see a typescript copy of the poem, that's not going to do me any good, right?
Right.
I need to see the handwritten copy of the poem in order to date it. Well, so there was a poem entitled, and this is probably not quite right, but close, lines composed or lines written in a copy of Milton. And that's the only title that it has, lines written in a copy of Milton. And so since Don didn't have images of that poem, and I didn't have images of that poem, I couldn't date the poem. Well, today I'm working through Lewis's personal library, and they hand me a copy of Lewis's Milton, and I open it up, and there, lo behold, on 2 pages in the front leaves is the poem.
Oh, great.
And then it only took me, 5 seconds. The final undated poem in the Lewis collection has been dated.
This happened today.
It happened today.
Wow.
And I wrote Don King immediately and said, it's 1944 or 45. So that was terrific.
Oh, fun.
That was great.
Wow, that's
you're talking about sometimes the dating really matters because of Lewis's dramatic adult conversion. And so when you're looking at a story such as Light, it means one thing if he's writing it as a non-Christian or a pre-Christian.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about what you were saying about how the dating can affect the interpretation of the work you're looking at.
Yeah, so Owen Barfield had said that the light story, which most people were referring to as The Man Born Blind, because it was first published in 1977 under that title, and the version was one that was in a Lewis notebook that Walter Hooper owned. Owen Barfield had said that that story was written by Lewis in the late 20s, before Lewis even became a theist, let alone a Christian.
Oh.
And that it was written specifically about an argument they were having as part of their Great War, that Lewis called it. And so it was an epistemological story. It was basically an allegory that said, if you think you can look back and see God by looking into yourself, you're not going to be able to do so. You cannot see the thing that makes it possible for you to see everything else. So Lewis at that point didn't think of God as God, but he thought of God as soul. He might have used the word spirit now that I think of it. And it was spirit then that gave us consciousness and thought. Well, then you can't. And so then he used the image of light to say, you can't see light. Light is the thing that allows you to see everything else. So the story is about a man born blind who gets his sight through a surgery, and then he goes around looking for light because he had read about light in Braille, in books by Ruskin or in Paradise Lost, and he wanted to see light. And he couldn't find it anywhere. Till one day he's wandering around a quarry, and for those who are listening, I'm about to spoil the story, but that'll just make you want to read it all the more. He's wandering around the lip of a quarry when he comes across a painter. He's never seen a painter before, so he doesn't know what the guy's doing. So he asks, "What are you doing?" And the man says, "Well, I'm trying to capture light, if you must know." And the hero Robin says, "Oh, so am I." And the guy says, "Well, there it is." And he points into the quarry, and the sun is just coming up, and the quarry is filled with fog, and the sun has lit up the fog so that it looks like liquid light. And the guy says, "There it is, real liquid, drinkable light." And Robin is so excited that he leaps off the quarry's edge into the fog, falls through, and dies. End of story, right?
Oh, wow.
So that's what Barfield said it meant, all right? And the Man Born Blind version of the story seems to bear that out, although the only copy we have of The Man Born Blind was written in the 40s. Now, I think maybe, though, that is written from a previously existing copy. But the light manuscript is definitely written from the notebook version of Man Born Blind. And there are different clues that I talk about in the book that will show you that. And the light manuscript has the kind of changes that make me think Lewis the Christian was seeing the story a little bit differently. That the light is much more about the light behind all lights, to quote Lewis, and that Robin is looking for that particular light. So I think Lewis Christianized his own story.
Interesting.
So you think it was would you say the mid 40s when that was rewritten?
44 or 45.
Wow.
Both versions.
That makes me think of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader and Reepicheep at the end of the story when he jumps overboard in the drinkable light.
Yes.
Yes,
good that's right.
There.
And you get that in Out of the Silent Planet too.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's a phrase like that in Milton, somewhere in Paradise Lost. I think he talks about drinkable light.
Yeah, I think it's book 3.
Yeah. I was just going to say that book 3. Yeah,
well, I've had to look at this sort of thing, as I've studied Lewis on light.
Well, he has the famous quote that's now at the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. But there's another version where he says slightly differently. He says, "You can't look at the sun, but by its light you see everything else." And it sounds like he's fiddling with the same metaphor.
Yeah, very much so.
That happened somewhat with Till We Have Faces. He had the idea before he was a Christian that he was going to retell the story from the sister's point of view, and she was going to try to vindicate herself. But then by the time he actually wrote it in the 50s, he was a Christian, and so it took on different meanings, especially the ending.
When did he write Meditations in a Tool Shed? Because that's also kind of picks up on that theme of seeing
David
things by the light versus looking through the light.
Versus looking
from
along.
40, I think that's 40s, isn't it?
Yeah.
Meditation and Tool Shed.
Yeah, I'm thinking later 40s, but I think so.
Yeah, he comes back to a lot of those themes. That would make sense.
Yeah. Well, it's even in Dawn Treader when they're at the Dark Island and a single beam of light comes in and they're able to follow the beam out of the darkness.
Yeah. I wanted to move on to another project of yours, the Fawn's Bookshelf.
Yeah.
I heard you give a talk on it at Taylor. Now, are we going to decide to bleep out any references to other institutions? Or is that okay? At a certain unnamed institution.
No, No, I would be Bud Taylor.
Well, I'm glad to give a talk at Wheaton College
Yeah,
on all of these.
Yeah, as soon as we're
Touché.
open to that type of thing,
Yeah.
you're invited.
Well, tell us about the Fawn's bookshelf, how you got the idea for the book, the central thesis, just generally tell us what contribution that makes to Lewis studies.
It started probably from two things. I can go all the way back to my dissertation where I wrote one of my chapters on myth. So I've always been fascinated by Lewis and myth. But a lot of other people have been fascinated by Lewis and myth and have written chapters for their books.
Right.
The one thing I've never seen up until The Fawn's Bookshelf by Charlie W. Starr, the one thing I had never seen is an entire book on Lewis's theory of myth. And so I thought, well, it's about time. But the initial impetus, though, was I was asked to speak at a conference for the C.S. Lewis and the Inklings Society. That one was held in Arkansas. And the topic of the conference was, Is Man a Myth? Which is one of the titles from Mr. Tumnus's bookshelf. And I thought, well, what if I play with that conference topic? And then I thought, well, what if we talked about all 4 books on Tumnus's bookshelf? And so I started doing some writing work, and it was 2 months before I had to speak at the conference, and I'd gotten onto around page 30, page 35, and I realized, well, first of all, it's way too long for a conference talk, right? It needs to be about 15 pages, but I thought, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish writing it. And I was just focusing on the 4 books on Tumnus's shelf at that point. And then when I'm done writing it, I'm going to set that aside for maybe bringing my myth chapter out of my dissertation together with this material and trying to put together something larger. But first then, I reduced it so I could give it as a conference talk. So it was those couple of things then, a previous interest in myth, a desire to want to write a book-length treatment on myth, and then the talk at the conference on the 4 books on Tumnus's shelf that brought about the Fawn's Bookshelf.
And give us the other 3 titles on Tumnus's bookshelf.
Yeah. Okay, so we got Nymphs and Their Ways, right? Which Tolkien misremembered as the love life of a nymph or something.
Yeah.
Love life of nymphs. It just won't do. Let's see. So there's that. Then the Life and Letters of Silenus.
Oh yeah.
All right. And now for our listeners who don't know who Silenus is, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find the Disney movie Fantasia.
Oh, that's an old one.
Yeah, I want you to go to it's either the last sequence or the second to last sequence where there are a lot of satyrs and fawns and mythical Greek creatures and the Greek gods playing around by throwing thunderbolts and such. And in that movie, you're going to see a rather portly fellow in a toga who's clearly drunk and he's riding on a donkey. That is Silenus, all right? And then you can study up on him. The other
shows
book
up in Prince Caspian.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
celebration, right?
Yeah.
So then Is Man a Myth is a book, and then Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, A Study in Popular Legend. And it was probably that title more than any that made me actually want to think through all 4 books, because why are gamekeepers and monks also mythic for the Narnians? Men, okay, but what? Well, gamekeepers, it came pretty quickly. In Narnia, where the animals talk, they don't have gamekeepers.
Right.
Monks was much tougher. Yeah, why are monks? And what you notice is there's no formal religion in Narnia.
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't think Lewis was particularly against that. It's just that in Narnia, they had Aslan.
Right.
They didn't need Protestant nymphs. Right.
Or Greek Orthodox.
Or
they didn't
Badgerodox or anything like that, right?
And although they have the White Witch, they don't have a fall kind of like we do here.
Right.
So they're not necessarily cut off in the same way. And,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So monks for the Narnians represent what happens when, and I think probably in a wonderful way for the Narnians, and I'll ask some the next time I meet some for sure. But I think monks represent for them what happens when creatures devote themselves totally and completely to their Aslan. And I bet monks are probably just wonderful beings to the Narnians. That's I thought, yeah.
There's a similar move to Is Man a Myth in Lord of the Rings. They are trying to find the halflings who've been taken off by the orcs. And they stop the riders of Rohirrim, riders of Rowan. Rohirrim, say that 10 times.
The Rohirrim.
The Rohirrim. That's why I was
Rohirrim.
Yeah.
the Rohirrim. Sorry.
Rohan, yeah.
The Rohirrim of Rohan. And one of them says, you're looking for halflings. Well, aren't those mythic creatures? Are we going to hear about these mythic things in the light of day? And Aragorn says, well, sometimes things that you consider mythic do show up in the light of day.
Yeah.
It's in their mind, we know hobbits to be real creatures, but to the writers, that's some kind of a myth.
Yeah.
So they had a similar enjoyment of playing with the idea that one person's myth is another person's reality.
Now, man a myth was significant to me because for the Narnians, it was just the question, is man real or just a myth? But I think for Lewis, it might have had a double meaning. One is man a myth in the sense of, are we dehumanizing man in the same way that we've been emptying the universe of all its meaning? So is man just a series of Freudian complexes and just a biological machine? But I also think for Lewis, it might have been, man is not a myth, and that's our problem because we were made to be mythic, right? We were made for mythic wonder, and there's that peculiar verse in John chapter 10 where Jesus says, "You were made to be gods,
right?
But you're not anymore. So we're not mythic enough."
Yeah,
especially when Tolkien and Lewis were writing, where logical positivism was so dominant that myth is something that is reviled, and you just study what is empirically verifiable, that science is the only means by which you can access truth.
Absolutely.
So, Charlie, what is the thesis of your book about myth? Because, of course, most Lewis scholars are aware that the whole issue of myth was key to Lewis's conversion when Tolkien convinced him that, well, yes, there are these multiple religions that have myths of a dying God. The difference is that in Christianity, the myth became fact. The myth was historical. So what do you add to that conversation?
There is, I think, a tripartite way of approaching Lewis's theory of knowledge. So the fancy word is epistemology, right? So the fancy word's that, but we're talking about a theory of knowing. And for the longest time, Lewis scholars have focused on something that Lewis himself wrote about, and that is reason and imagination.
Yeah.
But the other thing that Lewis mentioned, and if you bring enough pieces together, you start to see it a little bit more holistically. The other thing he mentioned was experience of the real. Experiences of reality. So instead of talking about Lewis's epistemology in terms of reason and imagination only, I think we need to talk about it in terms of reason, imagination, and experience. Or, to cite it from Perelandra, that moment when Ransom realizes, and this isn't a perfect quote, that the triple distinction of truth from myth and both from fact belonged only to the fallen terrestrial world, and outside the world it might have no meaning whatsoever. Right. So, the first really interesting question to me is, well, what's the difference between truth and fact? And then the second really interesting question to me is, in what way can myth be either true or fact? So I wanted to talk about that in the myth book. So, and I don't know, do you guys ever remember in school being taught that there's a difference between fact and truth? Can you think of a time ever?
No.
I remember being talked about the difference between fact and opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And how ridiculous that was, because I said, so if I ask, is Paris, France real? Is that a fact or opinion? That's a fact. And then I say, if I ask, is God real? Is that a fact or an opinion? Oh, that's an opinion. But wait, I just asked the same question.
Right.
Yeah.
So I realized there was something eminently wrong with saying that we should talk about the difference between fact and opinion. Well, for Lewis, then, fact and truth are not the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Fact is what is. Truth is always about what is.
Right.
And it has to do with correspondence with reality. If what's going on in my head is the same as what's going on out here. So if I see a white wall and it really is white, then I know truly. If I see a white wall with polka dots and no one else sees it, I probably am colorblind or something like that, right? That's a way oversimplification,
Or
but
somebody
you
hit
get
you
the
on the
point.
head.
Yes, or somebody hit me on the head. That's right. Yes. So several of the chapters in the book are going to talk about Lewis's theory of myth, how myth contributed to his conversion, where he did move from believing that myth had no connection to truth or reality to believing that it did, and then toward defining myth as a mode of knowing that is connected to reality at higher levels than it is normally. So Christ is the myth become fact, but myth can also connect us to heavenly realities, Platonic ideals, Platonic realities that we can't perhaps encounter any other way. And of course, the classic example that Lewis gives is in the essay Myth Became Fact, where he talks about two problems. The first problem is we can either think about something or we can experience, but we can't do both at the same time. So we can either laugh at a joke or think about why the joke was funny. As soon as we start laughing at or stop thinking about why it was funny, we stop laughing.
Yeah.
Or he says, if only my tooth would stop hurting, I could write another chapter for my book about pain.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, he talks about that with sun-soaked in some places as
Yeah.
well. There's the difference between the experience of it, and then as soon as you think about it, you sort of lose the experience.
There you go. Yeah, it's dead on. You're a lot smarter than I look. Sharp guy. Yeah. You need to keep this guy around.
You sit in a room with the Downings for long enough, and some stuff rubs off.
But the other thing Lewis points out is even when you experience love or beauty, you're only experiencing an instance of it, an example of it. Love, beauty, laughter, pain, only particular instances of it. To experience capital L love, capital T truth, that transcendent something is impossible except, at least at some scale, through a myth. In a myth, we can not just see something abstractly or experience an individual example of it, but we get to experience the big thing, the Platonic reality.
The thing in itself.
Yeah, the thing in itself. I think about that great moment in The Great Divorce when Heavenly Spirit is talking to the ghostly figure who is clearly a liberal theologian who has almost no beliefs whatsoever.
Right.
And the guy says, well, finding final answers, don't you think that's stifling? Isn't the search for truth all that really matters? And the heavenly fellow says, you believe that only because so far you've experienced truth in the abstract. I will take you to where you can be embraced by it. So, on earth for Lewis, truth is abstraction always. In heaven, truth is a person.
Right. And for those of us who grew up in the 20th century, the word myth essentially meant falsehood.
Right.
Yeah.
That's just a myth. And you'll still hear it
story.
used that way. Oh, fake. Yes.
Yeah.
And those people don't realize that there's this whole history of substantive definition behind myth, that myth is an explanation of ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And so even Christians, when they hear that Lewis was an advocate of myth, like, oh no, he can't be an advocate of myth because myth is false.
And Lewis says, that he loved pagans and he wished he lived in a pagan world again. So somebody asked him once if he would do a talk on Christians living in a modern pagan era, and he replied, "Oh, if only that were true," because pagans at least have much more understanding of the divine than modernists. The scientific materialists would have.
Well, he used a lot of words in a special way. When he said pagan, he was mainly thinking of the pre-Christian classical world.
Yeah,
and so sometimes you have to pay attention. He says
it's
somewhere
like
in
paying attention to his handwriting.
Yeah.
You have to pay attention to his vocabulary.
Well, you do, right.
Pagans were the people where the world wasn't disenchanted. There was still enchantment in the world.
Right.
It was easier to convince somebody that lived in that world that myths were true and that there was such a thing as miracles. We talked about some of these themes with Jerry in the miracles discussion.
Yes.
The book.
There's a lot in miracles on myth. Yeah. Well, here's something else that's really interesting about Lewis and myth. And this is something Lewis picked up from Owen Barfield. And Barfield probably had the same influence on Tolkien in this way. And I love this great line that I once heard from George Lucas, which is that myth is psychological archaeology. And what Barfield taught both Lewis and Tolkien through his book Poetic Diction is that the way people thought in the past, not what they thought about, not what they believed, but their very thought processes aren't necessarily the same kinds of thought processes that we have today.
Right.
And myth represents a mode of languaging. That's a fun term that I made up, languaging, where the myth itself is the language, not the language that we put it into to deliver the myth.
Yeah.
Yes.
And a myth could be delivered by non-language means. Even Lewis said, even a film or a mime. If you can get the myth across, the myth itself is the language. But it's speaking to you in the language is far more concrete than language is today. So you think of ancient hieroglyphics from a number of different cultures, and here you have these pictures that represent sounds. Why is it that our earliest languages are all picture languages? Something that M. Night Shyamalan explores in his movie Unbreakable. If you haven't seen that, that's Barfield and Lewis. Perfect. So check that film out. Myth represents a mode of thought that we kind of Well, we might have started to lose it earlier, but then when the Enlightenment came along, it died. And it's a mode of thought then that one of the things I do appreciate about postmodernity is it's a mode that we're starting to recover. The power to speak through story, apart from language, because there's something concrete to it, something less abstract to story speaking.
Right.
And that's one of the powers of film, isn't it?
Right.
And that's part of the reason Jesus' parables are so effective.
Yes.
I'm not going to just give you a definition or an adage. I'm going to tell you a story.
Yeah.
Barfield talks about that a lot in Saving the Appearances.
Yes. Yeah. The Barfield book to read, though, if you're a Lewis or Tolkien person and you have to read something by Barfield, which is a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
The thing, the sort of the Kabbalah of Lewis and Tolkien studies is Barfield's poetic diction.
Oh, yeah.
If you get poetic diction, and Saving the Appearances is not a really important Barfield book, but if you get poetic diction,
don't start with that one, though.
No.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to have to teach a Barfield class for graduate school this October, and I've been reading Barfield for the last 7 months, and I'm in the last book.
Oh, wow.
And I force myself to read a chapter a day because it's just torture, after so many months of reading Owen Barfield.
Yeah.
Right.
He was obscure, and he made up for it by being difficult. But he was a genius. It was Tolkien who said that Barfield is the only person who could sit in a meeting of the Inklings and hold up against Lewis.
Yeah,
Right.
So,
that's right.
Yeah, and his ideas are strange, but they're also very interesting, even if they're a bit heterodox, we might say. Or,
Well, and that's why we archive him at the Wade, because he is the person who convinced Lewis that you can believe in God. So that first step towards his Christian conversion was influenced by Barfield's theism.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think Barfield probably doesn't get enough credit.
Right.
We definitely credit Tolkien and Hugo Dyson with Lewis's conversion to Christianity, but Barfield certainly deserves credit for Lewis's conversion to theism.
Right.
Yeah.
We just, at the Wade, received several donations of original Barfield papers that have never been looked at from someone who was a student of his and then a colleague, and she was 103 years old. Wow. So that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to the day when I can look at that.
Yeah. Although we're having trouble dating the handwriting. So
we need
could use a little
Charlie.
help
Like a job
with
for
that,
Charlie.
I could probably tell you that it was Barfield or not, but I don't think I could date the handwriting. I can recognize Barfield's hand, but I'll tell you what would be hard to work with is Tolkien. Just the horror stories you hear about his handwriting and things. So.
Oh, no.
Right.
I picked the
Count
right
me out.
inkling. Yeah, I picked the right inkling to work with as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, his own son couldn't read his handwriting sometimes.
Really?
So, when you look at, Christopher will say, I can't make out this word. I don't know what he was trying to do.
Oh, wow.
I just want to say I love the name Charlie Starr.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like the hero of a YA novel.
Yeah.
That he's the quarterback, but he's also the lead singer in the High School Musical.
Well,
for some reason.
In all the books, it's Charlie W. Starr. Doesn't that just roll off the tongue?
Yeah, Charlie W. Starr.
Charlie W. Starr.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for joining us
What a
for
blast.
this conversation.
Yeah, really
It's
enjoyable.
been really fun.
Tons of fun. Thank you all so much.
Have a great time as you continue doing your research at the Wade.
Okay, thank you.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.